Welcome to Connection Complete, creating change from the inside out. We connect valuable community resources to you, our viewers. We're coming to you from the beautiful Brighton Chamber Conference Office, here at 218 East Grand River in Brighton. I'm Julia Barker.
I'm Mary Beth Patricus, Mama Bear Productions.
Beth Notarius, Certified Grief Recovery Specialist.
And today we are joined by Jennifer Howard. She's the Executive Director at the Michigan Great Lakes Chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. Jennifer, thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. We are wondering so much about Alzheimer's. This is a disease that's sadly affecting millions of Americans. And I want to know, first of all, what is Alzheimer's disease?
Sure. Well, Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease. So it is meaning that it is always getting worse. It is actually the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. And there are a lot of things that happen within the brain that produce structural changes and actual cell degeneration or death. And because of that, there are certain things that are affected. I think that when people think of Alzheimer's disease, they think of memory loss, which certainly happens, but it's actually so much more than just memory loss. When we think about all the things that our brain does for us every day, all of those things are affected. And so as the disease progresses, they do get to the point where they need 24-hour care.
So I think a common misconception is that it's supposed to be a normal part of aging. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we hear so often at the association. And we get phone calls from family members all the time saying, I'm really worried about my loved one. And I even, took my loved one to the doctor, and the doctor said, this is to be expected. But memory loss is not a normal part of aging. And Alzheimer's disease has had so much stigma behind it, and people really haven't been talking about it for too long. So it's not something that is people don't know a lot about it. They're not asking their physicians a lot about it. Not a lot of people are getting diagnosis of the disease, and so they think that this is a normal part of aging, and it's not. There are a lot of things that happen to the brain as we age, and so there are some changes that happen as we age, but nothing like what we see with Alzheimer's disease, which is a disease. I think that we never think about our brains aging with us, but they do. We think about our hearts aging, and we have normal body changes, and we don't think about the fact that our brains are aging with us. So it's normal for things to take longer for us to remember, and we get distracted more easily as we get older. So we're going to start losing the car keys a lot more. We're going to walk into a room and have no idea why we walked into that room, and then we're going to remember a couple minutes later and think, and that can be scary for people as they age, because they're afraid, oh gosh, is this the first signs of Alzheimer's? But there's a lot of those changes that happen normally. Alzheimer's is not that. It's completely different.
So with these signs of Alzheimer's, what are they, and what should people do if they start to notice any of them? Because I would imagine a lot of people are afraid to try to find out what's going on because it might be Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And so if you could speak about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a number of different things that happen. In fact, if people go to our website, alz.org, they can see the 10 signs and symptoms, but I'll just talk about a couple general signs that are very common. In general, sort of a big overview of it is that if there are changes that are happening that are sufficient enough or bad enough that it's affecting everybody's day-to-day life or a person's day-to-day life, that's probably a time to ask your doctor about it and to check that out further. Like I said, it's normal for people to, forget a word from time to time, or you see somebody and you forget their name for just a second, maybe you remember it a couple minutes later. But when people are suddenly unable to keep appointments, or they've always been the person who did finances in their house, and they're getting late payments now, the electricity is getting shut off. So that is one of the signs and symptoms, is somebody somebody having a hard time doing things that they normally are familiar with. People getting lost in familiar places. So, they've driven to the bank the same way for the last 10 years or to church on Sunday, and suddenly they become lost, getting to that place or coming home. That might be a warning sign. People can get a little disoriented in time and place, miss appointments, that type of thing. So there are a number of those types of signs, but I think when people realize it, it's when it's affecting their day-to-day life. And it's really interesting because sometimes even we see with couples, because they know each other so well and they've been together for so long, sometimes it takes even longer for family members to notice a difference because they're finishing each other's sentences all the time anyway. So it's very interesting in that regard. But what I would say is that if you're having normal slight slips, it's probably not something to be overly concerned about. But I think people know in the early stages of the disease, people are very competent, they know exactly what's going on with them, and they know that they're not functioning at the same level. They know that something's wrong. For the most part, sometimes people are in denial, sometimes it's family members that notice it first, but in general.
So, it is prevalent, but it's just because you have these symptoms does not mean that it's Alzheimer's. What's the importance of getting that diagnosis?
I couldn't emphasize how important it is to get a diagnosis. There are so many things that cause memory loss that aren't Alzheimer's disease. So that's the first thing. Vitamin deficiencies, medication interactions. If somebody's suffering a clinical depression, that can mirror the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. There are so many things that can be simply identified, treated, and cured. So that's first and foremost. Or if it is Alzheimer's disease, there may be some of those other things happening at the same time. And wouldn't you want to have those things treated for a dramatic improvement of quality of life?
Absolutely.
So yeah, that. And I think, people think, well, they're afraid of getting a diagnosis. They don't want to hear that. You're getting a fatal diagnosis. That's a really, really scary thing. But also people think, well, there's nothing that they can do about it anyway, so why do we need to do this? There's so many things that a family can do, that a person can do, and should do in the early stages of the disease, if that is what's going on. Planning for the future and having somebody who's living with the disease actually helping to make those care planning decisions. What happens all too often is that families don't get a diagnosis and don't figure out what's going on until it's too late. And then their loved one who's living with the disease, they can't be a part of those decisions. They may be at a point where they can't make those decisions for themselves anymore. That puts a really undue burden on the family. And that's if they all agree on what those decisions are. Sometimes we work with families where they get to that point and nobody agrees on what the care plan should look like. But also, it can be very empowering for people because people can get involved in not only caring for their own care plans, but getting involved in policy, getting involved in research studies, learning more about it, joining support groups for other people living with the disease. There's so many things out there, and they're denied all these things if they don't go forward.
I had a couple of coworkers who one's family member had Alzheimer's and the other had dementia, and listening to them speak to each other at work, they sounded so similar. So when we get back from break, I want to talk about the differences and I guess similarities between the two. So we'll be right back after this message from our viewers. We'll be right back after this message from our sponsors. Thank you for joining us. We're back. This is Connection Complete, creating change from the inside out. We're sitting today with Jennifer Howard, the Executive Director of the Michigan Great Lakes chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. We are going to continue our conversation. I just left us with that bit about coworkers that I had. One whom had a loved one suffering of Alzheimer's disease, the other dementia, and I saw so many similarities. It seemed like the same thing when they were speaking together in the office. Can you tell me what's the difference between the two, and maybe also other neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably the most common question that I'm asked is, what is the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And we kind of think about dementia as being an umbrella term. And what that means is it's dementia in and of itself simply means severe memory loss. It's memory loss, it's affecting a person's day-to-day life. There's some other things sort of categorized under that. But it really almost describes more of a set of symptoms. What it doesn't tell you is what's causing that memory loss. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of sort of non-curable degenerative diseases. There are lots of other types of diseases, like you were mentioning, Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia. We were talking during the break about Parkinson's. Some folks with Parkinson's will experience dementia in the progress of their disease. And so there are lots of things like that. But actually there are, when we were talking before, there are some things that cause dementia that are curable too. And they sort of all fall underneath that umbrella. Okay. So when you're referring to your coworkers, what I would have thought in my mind is, okay, one of your co-workers has a loved one who's been diagnosed with dementia, so they know what's going on, and the other one, they know that there's memory loss, but perhaps it hasn't been diagnosed yet. You know, my question would be, what's causing the dementia, and have they received a diagnosis? Maybe it's Alzheimer's also, or maybe it's something else, okay, or maybe it's a couple different things going on. So I would have encouraged that coworker to see about a diagnosis for their loved one.
That's great information.
Who is at risk for this disease?
That's a really good question. Another one I get asked a lot. And we always say, anybody if you have a brain, you're at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so now, having said that, there are people who are more at risk than others. Genetics plays a component, so we know that if you've had a grandparent or a parent with the disease, your chances are greater that you would have that disease than somebody who has had no family history. Does that mean you're never going to get it? Not at all, because we see people that get the disease who have no documented family history of Alzheimer's. There are some genetic markers that can be tested, and if you are positive for some of these genetic markers, it would increase your risk, but not necessarily mean that you're going to get the disease. It just increases the risk factor. There is a very rare form of Alzheimer's that is in younger onset Alzheimer's, and these are people that have a gene mutation. We call it predominantly inherited gene, this one gene mutation, and if they have that gene mutation, it runs very strong in those families, then it's 100% that they're going to get it, and they probably will develop the symptoms in their 30s or 40s, very, very young. And we work with families that have that. That is very, very rare. Okay. Most people with the disease get it 65 years plus. If they get it before the age of 65, we consider that younger onset. Those account for a smaller fraction of the overall population that have the disease. Now, to expand on your question a little bit, there are some things that people can do to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, and so we try to educate people about that, and that's really exciting. And just a brief overall is that we look at diet, we look at exercise, we look at social interaction, and we look at people that are challenging their brains to learn new things all the time. It's very interesting because people who have more education, higher degrees, keep mentally active on a regular basis, have challenging jobs and things like that, their risk is lower. They have lower, they develop it either later, they develop it less often. There's so many things like that, but it just recently, in the last maybe 5 years or so, the research has just overwhelmingly proved that that is the case. And we, just this past year, we know that if you do all of these things, you can actually lower your risk lower than if you had none of the genetic markers. Like, the genetic markers don't make as big of an impact on your risk as lifestyle does. And that's just breaking news this past year. And so the good part about that is we can do something about this. We can greatly reduce our risk of getting this disease. So that's exciting.
Absolutely.
So if you do get a diagnosis, what kind of treatment is available?
Another great question. So as I said before, Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death, and unfortunately the only one in the top 10 causes of death that has no way to effectively treat, cure, or even slow the progression of this disease. And so we're working on that with the research and through public policy efforts. There are some medications out there that are used to treat Alzheimer's. They don't work with everyone, but the people that they do work with, it tends to slow the progression down for a period of time, which is a good thing. If you can do that, you want to do that. But the overall trajectory of the disease doesn't change, unfortunately.
I have to jump in with a question on this. I
Yeah,
just have to.
please.
There is a tremendous amount of incredible, valuable education that the Alzheimer's Association provides. And the one that intrigues me in terms of, it may not be treatment, but what behavior or approach can a caregiver do that will impact the quality of the care and the ease and the behavior issues that people associate with the Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many things, and I before I did the job I'm doing now, I was our education coordinator for a long time, and I've talked to a lot of families. The types of things that we try to educate people on, first and foremost, is about the disease, because I think if you understand the actual process of what's happening, it helps you understand how to interact with the person who's living with memory loss. There are things that we talk about in communication. Somebody suffering from this disease, communication becomes difficult, usually somewhat early in the disease, and then it just gets worse from there. But there's so much to communication that isn't necessarily intuitive. Actually, there's so much about this disease that's not intuitive. And so I always tell people, take your logic and reason and just leave it outside. Like, okay, we're gonna think in a brand new way right now. We're gonna think about how people respond to nonverbal communication. We're gonna think about how we walk into a room. We're gonna think about the expression on our face. We're gonna think about how quickly we talk, and the simplicity of the sentences that we're saying and those types of things. We're also going to realize that no amount, the famous phrase is, you can't argue with somebody with Alzheimer's. And there's a lot to that, because you can't convince somebody to remember something that is physically not there in their memory bank anymore. And I think it's almost liberating for families when they realize that they can let go of some of these things, you know. But I think it's human nature for us to, if somebody's struggling, to want to try to help them, or to say, don't you remember, you know, you remember that summer that we did this or we did that, and they don't. No, let's think harder, let's try to remember. That can be very frustrating for the people with the disease and for family members as well. And so we educate them about those communication techniques, about the disease itself, you know, what to let go of, what to not let go of, and
what to build on.
And there's still so much, even in the late stages of the disease, there's so many beautiful moments to be had, so many amazing things to do, and you just have to think about it in a different way. Be creative, you know, again, leave logic and reason at the door, and just go to the place where that person is in that moment, and then some beautiful communication and wonderful times can still be had.
I know that both Beth and I'm sure the association have a lot of information on what we just mentioned, you know, end stages and how much beauty there can still be in dealing with something so tough, really heartbreaking. But can we talk before we wrap it up here about other things or the most important things that the Alzheimer's Association is doing to help?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our vision is a world without Alzheimer's. So we want to put ourselves all out of work. That would be a beautiful thing. I will get my resume all spiffed up, and on there I'll say helps found an end to Alzheimer's, and I'll move on to other wonderful things, you know, because that is first and foremost what we want to do. So we are the world's largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research. We have an international research grants program. We're trying to fund really good cutting edge research. At the same time, we're trying to pull all those researchers together, get them talking to each other, collaborating. So we're a huge forum and sort of convener of researchers coming together and getting them working on projects together. At the same time, we're trying to get people into research studies. So we recruit families here at the local level to get involved in local research. And we have a lot of Alzheimer's research happening right here in our backyard in Michigan. So a lot through the University of Michigan, and we try to talk to people about those studies and get them involved. So there is that. In the meantime, until we find a way to prevent this disease or to derail it from where it is right now, we still have over 5 million people in the United States living with the disease, over 180,000 right here in Michigan. Those families need programs and services. So we have free education programs. We have support groups in all of our areas, all of our counties. At our website, again, at alz.org, people can find those. We also have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365 helpline. And that is usually the first time, that's a great way to start with the association, to find all of these other things. It's our mission to link people not only to our services, but to get them to other wonderful community resources on a local level. So we've got huge databases of everybody who works with those with Alzheimer's online and sort of in our heads too. When people call and they say, you know, oh gosh, we need some help or we need respite. Okay, great. Let's talk about what that looks like. We know all sorts of places in the community that can help you out. Let us help link you to those places.
So, Jennifer,
yeah.
can we ask,
Yeah.
so you're talking about these resources and whatnot. How can people get involved in the community and get, where can they go to find out how they can get involved, I guess is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, there are a number of organizations, and they look different from community to community.
Okay.
But a great place to start is by calling the 800 number, which is 800-272-3900. Because we have those resources at our fingertips, and if somebody calls, they get a real live human being 24 hours a day, which is really nice, even on the holidays, every day of the year. So we can talk to them about that. It's a good place to start, or they can go online and find places. What I find is that most families call us and they don't know what they need. They just know that they're burnt out, they know that they're tired, they don't know where to go. So sometimes just having a conversation with somebody, a care consultant, a social worker, whether us or through another community or organization, just to talk about their situation and kind of pull that apart and see what kind of supports they need. Maybe it's homemaker services, maybe it's respite care, maybe it's just education, maybe it's a support group. We can pull that apart and figure out on an individual level what that family needs.
And that 800 number again is what?
It's 800-272-3900. Yes, ma'am.
Fantastic. I mean, it's all been just great information. I think I mentioned to you before we had our conversation here today, my knowledge about Alzheimer's disease it's not very extensive. I've seen the Notebook movie, and I think we talked a little bit about, how, in the movie, the gentleman tries to get her to remember. Essentially, it's not working, and I think, that's probably a lot of, Hollywood and pop culture plays a part in what we believe about something. So sitting down with you today has been so great for me. I know Beth has a personal experience with this disease. It's affecting millions of us here in the U.S. So thank you so much for coming on and clarifying some really great questions I think we answered today.
Thank you, Jen.
Yes,
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
This has been another episode of Connection Complete, where we create change from the inside out. Thank you again, Jennifer Howard, for coming on with us today. I'm Julia Barker.
I'm Mary Beth Patricius, Mama Bear Productions.
Beth Notarius, Certified Grief Recovery Specialist.
We hope you join us again next time.